Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 7 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay or Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Kristina Hooper, Chief Global Market Strategist from Invesco. Thank you for joining us here this morning. Talk to us about the Fed. Talk to us about what happens in a Trump world.
So I think the Fed was right to be very emphatic in saying that they're not going to guess, assume, speculate about what policies are coming down the pike and the timing of them. So at this point, it's all about the data and what is actually showing up in the data today. Now, there is some risk that inflation resurges. And that has absolutely nothing to do with who is sitting in the White House. And so I think the Fed needs to be super careful. And so I think the Fed is not necessarily going to cut in December. It is not a fait accompli. It's going to be really dictated by what we see released in the next weeks before the meeting. I do think there's probably some caution in terms of worrying a bit about what could happen if we see a lot of Trump policies come to fruition in terms of stimulating growth and higher inflation. But at this point, the Fed is not going to act on it. And I don't think it will until it shows up in the data or it's reliable enough in terms of the scope and the timing that they can add it to their economic projections.
Well, Kristina, I was listening to Bruce Kasman over the weekend. He and Joe Lupp in the At Any Rate podcast at JP Morgan. We know who they are. You know, they're talking about revising up growth expectations in the U.S., revising them down in the Eurozone and China. Do you agree with that? And what is the impact on inflation from that?
Well, I don't think that that's wrong. I don't know if it's going to be as dramatic as we assume. I certainly think that U.S. growth is going to be stronger. It has been stronger. So this would just be a continuation of a trend that we've seen. And it might get some kind of boost from Trump policies. Again, we just don't know the scope. We don't know the timing. We don't know what policies they'll focus on first. I do think that the Eurozone could face some headwinds, but I do think that we're going to be seeing a reacceleration in growth there as well. It's just not going to be as strong as in the United States. So I don't think it's as dramatic a situation. I don't think there's going to be that significant a change from what we anticipated months before the election.
Well, Kristina, here's the disconnect for me. Like, I agree with you. It's going to take time for fiscal stimulus to come through. It's going to take time, quite frankly, for the tariffs to come through, right? Because he's going to use that as a negotiating tool. And by he, I mean, President-elect Donald Trump. But, sentiment is, not to be, played with, not to be trifled with, if you follow me here. I mean, sentiment can start pricing this into markets far more quickly, far more, rapidly than we otherwise expect. I mean, what's the potential for that to happen between now and the end of this year?
Oh, I certainly think there's the potential for that to happen. We're already seeing a very visceral reaction in markets. But I just want to draw the distinction between what happens in markets and what happens in the economy. We could see very well markets discount a strong economy in 2025. And I'm not going to argue with that. I do think we're going to see a reacceleration in the U.S. But I do think markets have a way of reacting very, very robustly sometimes to what they think will happen. And then there's a point where markets are likely to moderate. It's not dissimilar to what we saw in 2016, where we saw a very strong rally and some retracing. So I would anticipate that's likely. But I certainly think we're going to see the exuberance in markets in a more distinct way than we will see show up in economic growth. Now, that's not to discount that psychology plays a role, that when sentiment is better on the part of consumers, on the part of businesses, they spend more. And I also think we're just going to get a bump from having election certainty. The biggest risk that was before going into the election was that we'd get some kind of challenge, we'd have prolonged uncertainty. That's behind us. And so now all those spending plans and hiring plans that had been held in abeyance by companies, and all those spending plans that had been held in abeyance by consumers, that can start again.
All right, Kristina, Chief Global Market Strategist for Invesco. Where do you go globally here, knowing what we know?
So We certainly know that policies are going to be supportive for the U.S. economy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that economies outside the U.S. are left out. Yes, we might see some headwinds in the shorter term, but I do think, as I mentioned, the European economy as well as the UK economy will reaccelerate next year. I think we could see a scenario where, especially if we work out the tariff issues quickly, where we see a global economy that reaccelerates. And so that means investors need to be thinking broadly. It's not just about U.S. equities, especially because valuations are so high. So within the U.S., I would add to exposure to small and mid caps because I think those will benefit very much from the environment, from Fed easing as well as Trump policies. And then, of course, looking globally, I think there's a lot of opportunity in lower valuation places, UK equities, emerging markets equities. So I think we need to be focused not just on growth, but on valuations, and that leads to diversification.
Emerging market equities, that is music to my ears.
Oh, no.
No, I'm kidding. But I would love to ask you, obviously we can't ignore what's going on in currencies here, and we've come a long way in a very short period of time. Initially, we saw MEX, we saw the China yuan, we saw the Korean won, all depreciate on the back of the Trump victory, and then, came all the way back almost, right? In the case of the Mexican peso, it actually appreciated for a bit there, and then Friday we kind of melted down, and we continue to be melting down here. Kristina, talk to us a little bit about what the dollar, what is it telling you here?
So what I think it's telling us is that there's a lot more to the currency picture than who is sitting in the White House. In fact, more is dictated by Fed policy. And so I think we have to recognize that the U.S. dollar is likely to weaken, but it's going to have different relationships with different major currencies. And it's going to ease more relative to some currencies than others. And that will play out over time as we see what other central banks are doing as well, in addition to the growth picture. I think it's really important to recognize that a strong U.S. economy doesn't mean that other economies necessarily suffer. So we have to just watch this play out. But to me, what it's telling us is that this is not just who's sitting in the White House.
All right, Kristina, thank you so much for joining us. Kristina Hooper, she is Chief Global Market Strategist for Invesco, giving us her thoughts on these markets.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube.
Let's check in with Zach Cohen, congressional reporter. I don't know what he's doing down there. Zach, you still have some House races that have yet to be called. Where are we? What's going on with those things?
Sure. Republicans are certainly the driver's seat at this hour. They've netted at least 3 seats, picked up a number of others, but Democrats have also flipped a couple of seats for a total of +3 at this juncture. Obviously, the magic number to watch is 218 on Bloomberg.com. And right now they're hovering at around 215 at least. And so they're really on the margin here. There's a couple of outstanding races, mostly west of the Mississippi River, many of them in California, some in Iowa, Arizona, Alaska even. And so as those ballots continue to come in, especially mail-in ballots that can arrive after Election Day, those need to be counted before some of these closer races can get called, and whether we find out whether, in fact, Speaker Mike Johnson gets to keep the gavel.
Zach, we're starting to see some announcements out of the White House this morning, at least Stefanik, for example. Talk to us a little bit about, Trump's cabinet. What can we expect to hear over the next few days, weeks? Talk to us about U.S. Treasury Secretary.
Yeah, so certainly Elise Stefanik, the Republican from New York, being tapped to be the ambassador to the United Nations, replacing Nikki Haley, who obviously ran against, then former President Donald Trump, now President-elect Donald Trump, and probably was not going to get that role again. This is somebody who sort of worked her way up through the Republican ranks, started off as a real moderate representing upstate New York, and eventually became what she would call ultra MAGA, very aligned with the Trump movement, and that seems to be paying off for her. All of Trump's Senate confirmable appointees will need to go through the Senate confirmation process. However, he's been asking the next Republican leader, whoever that might be, whether it's John Thune, John Cornyn, Rick Scott, to kind of waive that process entirely and allow him to install cabinet and other appointees through what are called recess appointments, which are allowed under the Constitution. It remains to be seen whether Congress would allow that procedure, that expedited procedure. But all of that is going to need to happen pretty quickly come January.
Zach, give us a sense as we step back and look at this holistically. How much of a red sweep has it been for the Republicans? And in fact, what can President Trump get done here, given that he has control of the Senate, appears to be at or close to control of the House? How much of a red sweep is it really?
I mean, the fact that Trump was able to carry all 7 battleground states with the addition of, I believe, Arizona late last night or early this morning certainly indicates that this was a Republican, maybe not a wave, that we're sort of past the era of wave politics. The fact that we're talking about a Republican victory potentially in the House, that'll be determined by just a handful of votes, just given the fact that gerrymandering and partisan sorting, people voting with their feet to places like California or Florida, depending on their politics, really makes it hard for either party to win the kind of results that we saw back in the day where, Reagan would be able to win 49 out of 50 states without batting an eyelash. But certainly the fact that Trump will come into power, certainly with a Republican-controlled Senate, means wonders for his efforts to overhaul the federal bench. He'll be able to appoint judges not just to the Supreme Court, but also to lower appellate courts and federal district courts, some of those benches that make up the vast majority of federal litigation. And so certainly either through recess appointments or through actual confirmation, he's got some power there.
Thanks, Zach. Tom Horman's been announced as the border czar, and I'm looking at, what many believe Trump is about to embark on the largest deportation program in U.S. history. Talk to me about that announcement, that appointment. What do you expect out of that?
Certainly, I have to check if he was actually nominated to be Secretary of Homeland Security, which is subject to Senate confirmation, or if this is sort of a czar-like position where he's named, but with that, with sort of limited power to promulgate regulations that be able to do the kinds of things that Trump is talking about. Some of this can be done via executive order. I would expect, within the first couple of days, we see some of the return to Trump-era policies around remain in Mexico or catch and release, so to speak. But certainly, Homan and others are going to have some pretty vast power under existing statute to change current immigration law, whether a Republican-led Senate, even a potentially narrow one, if Dave McCormick doesn't hold on in Pennsylvania, that race has been called, but apparently is too close to call for some Democrats, then maybe we could see a confirmation fight if Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski have some concerns about any of these picks. So that'll be worth watching as well.
Zach, what's the to-do list for Congress right now?
Certainly got to figure out government funding that expires in December, so we get another shutdown fight on our hands. If you've got Democrats who are hoping to lock in federal funding levels for at least the first 9 months of the next Trump administration, and there'll be probably some Republicans as well who'd want to go along with that, just to sort of clear the plate and allow Trump to come in, set budget levels, and come up for his own spending plan for the next couple of years. Although some Republicans certainly will want to hold off on that decision in order to give the incoming Trump administration the ability to set funding levels for the current fiscal year that started September 30th of this calendar year. We'll likely see a defense authorization bill, military policy bill that passes every year and has for the last 60 some odd years. That's usually a pretty bipartisan affair. And certainly Democrats are going to want to confirm as many judges as possible to the federal bench while they have unilateral control of that process. There's a number of vacancies, not at the Supreme Court level, obviously, but for lower appellate levels and at the district courts that they could see done with a simple majority, even if Trump wants them to hold off on that.
Zach, the U.S. fixed income market is closed today, but the bond market vigilantes are far from dead. Talk to us about Treasury Secretary Howard Lutnick. Is it going to be John Paulson, Glenn Youngkin, Scott Bessent? If you're a betting man, where do you place your bet?
It entirely depends on not just obviously who Trump wants as his Treasury Secretary, to be the primary ambassador for the American economy overseas, as Janet Yellen has done, but certainly what the market will bear in the Senate. As I mentioned, senators are coming in, Republicans with 53 seats most likely, assuming this result in Pennsylvania holds, and having flipped seats in West Virginia, Montana, and Ohio. And so that gives them a pretty sizable majority to be able to confirm really whoever Trump wants in that job. And I could see somebody confirmed by January 20th. Remember, Congress comes in January 3rd, and that's the beginning of the new Congress. And then there's a number of days before the inauguration of the next president on January 20th. So it's not unusual for the Senate to start confirming nominees for a president-elect, so that way they can come in with their team in place. And I would imagine Treasury Secretary and other cabinet appointees would fit the bill on that one.
Hey, Zach, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Zach Cohen, he's a congressional reporter for Bloomberg Government down in Washington, D.C.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 7 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Nick Stadtmiller joins us. He's our in studio. He's head of product at Medley Global Advisors. He does this thing, Damian, called emerging markets.
Never heard of him.
Exactly. Nick, what emerging markets do you focus on, and which is the most, I think, attractive to you at this moment?
Well, historically, I've done the CEMEA region, so Turkey, the Gulf, Russia, Ukraine. I've spent quite a few years living in most of those places. But sort of over the last couple of years, I've been looking a lot more globally. And in terms of what looks interesting to me right now, quite frankly, I'm a bit worried about a lot of emerging markets right now. But I think if I were, if someone held a gun to my head.
Why is that?
Well, I think that the biggest risk that I see is an inflationary U.S. and a deflationary China. And if both of those happen at the same time, it's going to be really bad for emerging markets for quite some time. But if somebody held a gun to my head and said, what do you like right now? I think I would probably be focusing more on frontier markets and further down the credit stream. So lower rated distressed sovereigns in places like sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia.
All right, that's not like Mexico or Brazil that this dude talks about.
Yeah, but he's talking about the dollar bonds, Paul. I mean, look, let's get into the nitty gritty here. I mean, let's first begin with Central and Eastern Europe, right? Let's talk about Hungary. Let's talk about Viktor Orban. He was first one to graduate Trump after he won. Let's talk about this rumor that Trump and Putin spoke just a few days back, and now I think the Kremlin's rejecting that. I mean, what's up? What's down? What's going on in your region?
Well, I think the situation with Orban and Hungary is a bit mixed because, of course, Orban's thrilled to see Trump win. They share a lot of political ideas. And
they share a locker at Tamarack. No, I'm joking.
And I'm sure that Trump would be very supportive specifically of Orban when he can. But the fact is that Trump is much a Eurosceptic, a skeptic of the transatlantic alliance. And there are a lot of worries about the euro and the U.S. relationship with the European Union. And the Hungarian forint, Czech and Poland, those are all sort of high beta versions of the euro and very closely tied to the fates of the euro. So the irony is, even though Orban really, supports Trump, it's probably not going to be very good for financial markets in Central Europe, and you're starting to see that filter into to currency prices there.
And what about the impact of the German coalition, falling out of bed here? I mean, there's got to be an impact on some of these periphery markets like Poland, like Romania, Hungary, the Czech Republic. I mean, any sort of spillover from that?
Well, I think right now it seems sort of minimal. One of the weird things that's happened is German bunds are starting to trade through euro interest rate swaps, which suggests I would say bad financial market conditions for the European bond market, and that sort of thing always filters in. And the higher risk, the emerging sort of periphery of the EU is always going to suffer. But in the short term, I think a little bit of domestic political instability in Berlin is probably not going to throw the European Union off its rails.
Now, for our audience who's not following that, what we're seeing are swap spreads in the Eurozone, specifically SCHAT spreads, 2-year swap spreads in Germany. Narrowing.
What are we seeing?
We're seeing a little bit of disruption in the plumbing of the European fixed income market, right, in the funding markets. And what we look at are European swap spreads, specifically German SCHAT's 2-year swap spreads, which is
German
it's the spread between it's the spread between European swaps and basically the underlying bonds. And what you've seen are them narrow as the bond market is effectively sold off, right? So,
Lisa, I've been on Wall Street for 35 years. I've never heard that once before.
I mean, you have to be looking at this, Paul. I mean, this is like looking at the plumbing of the U.S. market, right? But I mean, really where we are, Nick, I mean, is you're talking about, financial conditions tightening in Europe, right? And so what does that mean? I mean, does that mean that, we're going to see more stimulus out of the Eurozone, or is that something we could be waiting for as well here in the U.S.?
Well, I think at the margin, it increases the chances that the European Central Bank is going to have to cut a bit more aggressively. But the history of European policymakers is that they do the bare minimum after they're absolutely forced into it. So I wouldn't get too preemptive and call a very bold move from European central bankers quite yet.
So let's shift a little bit and look a little further south into the Middle East and look into Israel. I know that's right in your wheelhouse as well. Let's look at, what's going on in the Gulf region. I mean, any thoughts there? I mean, what does a Trump administration mean for the Middle East, for Saudi Arabia, for some of these other markets?
Well, Trump and his family have cultivated very strong ties with the Saudi leadership and other senior Gulf officials around the region. So I'm sure in a lot of Gulf capitals, there's a lot of celebration going on about the prospects of a second Trump presidency. But ultimately, I think the complication that you have with Israel and the fact that since the conflict began with Hamas and the more recent conflict with Iran, the Saudis have sort of got cold feet about the idea of normalizing relations with Israel. So it's going to be very difficult for Trump to keep all of his friends and partners in the Middle East happy, continuing to support Israel, which he's unequivocally said that he will do, while at the same time trying to broker some sort of deal between Israel and Saudi. It's kind of a tough climb, so I would say expectations are pretty high. But more broadly, I think that the Gulf will definitely bask in a moment of good relations with the U.S. here.
What's your call on China here?
My call on China is kind of like what I said about the European authorities earlier, is that the Chinese, and I don't think it's that the Chinese officials are slow to react, it's just they have a very different reaction function. And so they will continue supporting the market. The Politburo was quite clear that they're going to draw a line under house prices. But this is a balance sheet problem. And the balance sheet problem is you have a slumping stock market and, more importantly, a slumping property market, which is really eating into consumer confidence. And the Chinese consumer, even before all of this happened, was not an aggressive, leveraged play. Chinese consumers have always been big savers and very conservative. The government needs to get asset prices moving in the right direction to get confidence going, to get consumer spending up in China. And that's going to take time. And I think the way investors think about this is, okay, announce a big bazooka today, and then in a month or two, Chinese consumers are going to spend again and everything's going to be fine. This is a multi-quarter, if not multi-year balance sheet problem that authorities are trying to solve. They will do it, but they will do it on their own time frame. And I think investors are going to be disappointed by how long that takes.
Nick, last question, 30 seconds here. At the outset of our conversation, you mentioned, sub-Saharan Africa, right? Some of these frontier sovereigns, which are all dollar bonds, but I mean, the spreads on those dollar bonds have come in quite considerably, right? I mean, if you look at the EM distressed, the BOFA EM distressed index, it's up 60% year to date, largely because of spread compression in the sovereign space, high yield sovereign space. Just how much juice is left in those bonds, really?
Well, probably not another 60%, but I think the story for why the outlook is I think pretty good going forward is, one, you're seeing ongoing reforms and improvements, places like Egypt, which is up there, not sub-Saharan, but in northern Egypt. You're continuing to see good reforms. And I think they're also a little bit less exposed to higher dollar yields because rates are already so high. They move up another 50, 100, 200 basis points. It's not going to kill them.
All right, Nick, thank you so much for joining us. Nick Stadtmiller, head of product, Medley Global Advisors. They're out there in Milwaukee, but he's here in New York City. And there's no way you're getting this dude from like Saudi Arabia, wherever he was, to go to Milwaukee. It's a great town, though, by the way. Nick Stadtmiller, thanks so much for joining us.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 7 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.
All right, folks, your daily look at the front pages around the world. Lisa, Mateo, front pages in the newspapers. What's going on out there?
All right. Have either of you ever taken a cruise to like Norway or like some of these cold Arctic like destinations?
No, but I'm thinking about it.
You are?
I'm thinking about a cruise coming up in the fall.
Okay. So here's the thing. Okay. Travelers are paying, well, I don't know if you're going to pay this, but $10,000 for a 7-night stay on this luxury vessel. You see whales, walruses, polar bears, right? But climate change, this is from the Washington Post. They say it's starting to change things. The rapid ice melts, it sparked this polar cruise boom, like more people going, because it's opening up these easier paths for the boats to get in and around. It's extending the season, but at the same time, it's also melting the attractions that people want to see. So you have certain places where they may not be having these cruises for very long because a few decades from now, they might not be there. So that's a change that they're starting to see, but it's pretty pricey.
I mean, I've never been on a cruise, to be honest with you. I mean, Lisa, I mean, talk to me about, that whole beauty of being on a cruise in a post-pandemic environment. They still have the buffet special with an unlimited shrimp cocktail. I mean, that's just so healthy.
I have not done one yet. I know. I've been meaning to, but I'm telling you, it's the Arctic is the way to go for a lot of these. That's what they're saying. But
it's the experience.
Charlie Pellet is our cruise person. He's our expert.
Right.
Yes.
You got to ask him if he's been on,
he'll cruise
on the Norway cruise.
Anywhere. Like he takes a cruise to go see the oil rigs in the northern Atlantic. Like there's 3 people on the cruise ship, and he's one of them. So anyway, that's our Charlie Pellet. What else you got?
All right. So have you been to any of your kids' parents' weekend? I know you have a son. You have a son, too, that's in college. Well, now more parents are actually joining in on the festivities. We're talking Jell-O shots, beer pong, flip cup. They're taking part in all the festivities. This is in the Journal. A lot more parents, they say they want to party. Their kids say that they're cool with it. They start drinking at 8:30 in the morning because, the football games start at noon. And the thing they do say they pass on is the cheap beer. So they bring their own mini bottles of Tito's in their little fanny packs. So they bring those along.
That I can relate to, but I mean...
their own little, cocktails in their water flasks. But some parents, you have the flip side. Some parents are saying, no, it's not right. Like, you got to be a parent. So
Miami didn't have Parents Weekend this weekend, but Tulane University did. And, shout out to Robin Hoberman, Little Kings Lane, Rybrook, New York. I got a picture of her on a mechanical bull this weekend. So let's just be clear, you're never too old to get on a mechanical bull in New Orleans.
Yeah. So, I mean, parents are getting into it.
Parents
well, they're probably like,
really...
hey, I'm paying a good... amount of money. I'm going to go down and enjoy this.
Or a lot of them are saying they want to relive the golden years. Maybe no. You got to bring along the Tums. I'm saying if you're going to trip like that. This is something right up your alley, Paul. So this is in Bloomberg Screen Time newsletter. Has a look inside Netflix's move into live programming. So we've been hearing more about it, right? The past couple of years, live cooking shows, tennis match, hot dog eating contest, comedy special, football games, wrestling, and in a few days you have that boxing match between Jake Paul, Mike Tyson. That's the big draw. But some people are saying it's weird because Netflix kind of created this streaming service as an alternative to live TV, but it's all about advertising. Like a lot of its customers pay more to avoid the ads, but with live programming, they can put the advertisers in front of all the customers.
Right. No matter sports is kind of, when you think about the ad dollars, shifting from traditional media broadcast networks, cable networks going to streaming, it's just a matter of time before these streaming services get into sports.
This is right in your wheelhouse, Paul Sweeney. And for me, Netflix is just eating everyone else's lunch. And we have Walt Disney earnings coming in on Thursday.
Yep.
You know Walt Disney better than most. What do you expect out of that? It's...
Walt Disney Company's become basically a theme park company. That's, more than half of their operating profit. And so we'll have to see. But again, they're trying to navigate the migration to streaming. All I know is I did not watch the Penn State game, the whiteout game on Saturday evening because it was on Peacock. I'm like, I'm just not going there. I got enough things hitting my credit card. I'm not going to Peacock to watch Penn State. So, Dan Ives was there, by the way. Yeah, exactly. Out of principle.
Out of principle.
Exactly. What do you have?
All right. So we talked about, the parents living it up at colleges, drinking up. But now we have winemakers. This is on the flip side. They're going to the younger, health-conscious drinkers. So they're making more wines with less alcohol and fewer calories. You've seen the popularity, right? The hard seltzers really got it. But the Wall Street Journal is saying, okay, overall wine sales, they've declined for a third year in a row. But you have the light wine category. It's actually increased $209 million in sales 2024 from $16 million in 2019.
Light wine?
Light wine. They're about $15 a bottle.
Okay.
It goes about 80 calories as opposed to 120 calories. It's usually white wine because the red wine is a little bit tougher because it already has more alcohol and more sugar in it. But they do it. They don't just add water. So they're not just diluting it. They're using this distillation process to remove a portion of the alcohol. But some people are saying they don't like the taste. I don't know.
All right. So this company in Woodville, Washington, the state of Washington, the company removes alcohol from 30% of the finished wine and combines it with an unaltered wine to preserve the taste. About a quarter of buyers become return customers according to the survey.
Paul Sweeney, I'm 50 years old, and for the better part of my life, people were trying to figure out how to inject more alcohol into a sip of into a beverage, and it's kind of like the rest of the world. The U.S. we've been on a globalization path. Now we're getting more into a nationalistic path. We're sort of cutting off our relationships with everyone, and now we're cutting off all the alcohol. I'm stressed. I just don't even know what to do.
I don't know what to do.
Well, I don't mind the idea of it, because then you can have like a second glass without feeling guilty.
How is that?
Feels guilty. First there's light beer, so I guess why wouldn't there be a light wine?
Yes, but it's usually the white. The white wine is easier. But yeah, that's the new trend. I'm going to have to check it out.
I doubt we're going to get a light Jameson.
No, not happening.
My friends over in Ireland. Yeah. So, all right, Lisa Mateo with the newspapers.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live each weekday 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.